Alright, you're going to find prefabs and Visgroups to be two handy things to speed up your map creation process. Let's start talking about prefabs. Prefabs are groups of entities and brushes that have already been saved together basically in a mini map that you can place easily throughout your map. And you can place prefabs with either the entity or the block creation tool. If you click on either of these tools, you'll see in the categories we have our typical entities, and we have prefabs as well as prefabs Half-Life 2 or whatever game you're currently running. So Half-Life 2 has a lot of prefabs you'll find in some different games, but you'll find the same list of those prefabs in both the block and the entity tool. But when you place them with the different tools, they're going to have different characteristics. So the base prefab will be the same, but if we place a prefab, just pick one at random here from our prefabs Half-Life 2. Just grab a button keypad. If we place a prefab with the entity tool, we can place it in a 2D view or anywhere in our 3D view. Let's get our camera over there. So when you place a prefab with the entity tool, the object cannot be scaled. It's a group of different objects, different entities and brushes already created there. But that's it. We have no ability to scale it. We can move it. Let's scale our grid down here. We can move it around, but we can't scale it. You can ungroup it, and at that point you can move around the separate pieces, but it's kind of set in its prefabness. If we were to place the same prefab with the block creation tool, grab our button keypad, we actually can click and drag a size, much like you can typically with the brush tool. So you can get an area much bigger than the entity created prefab, and you'll see that it creates all the prop objects in their set scale, since props cannot be scaled. But the brush, this little piece we had here, the little trigger, which we'll go over, is scaled to whatever the size that we drew was. So if you have prefabs for stairs or something like that, you might want to place them with the block tool so you have more ability to scale them. If you want to keep to the standard that has been set, then you can just use the entity tool and everything will be the perfect dimensions and everything will line up with textures and stuff like that. So, alright, so let's go ahead and create our own prefab using the developer textures we just talked about. And we'll just make a simple room which we'll be able to reuse as we go through our functionality. So use the block tool, make sure you're back on primitives. If you're on prefabs, you're just going to be drawing prefabs all day. So block tool, and we'll shrink our grid down about 16. Zoom in a little bit. Let's just do a simple, what have we been doing, about 16 by 128 by 128. Something like that. I believe that's actually the perfect wall. So this guy selected, we can get our camera in there. Change our texture from our brick to our dev, DEV, and go down to just a measure wall 01A. Your standard wall, apply. We're going to want to align it to the top left. Well, it's backwards there, but top left. Zoom in, you'll see you can actually get that white border right on the edges there. 128 by 128, so this guy here is 128 by 128. You got a perfect wall, but it's a pretty small room. So just maybe quadruple that. We'll go up to 512. There we are. And if you take a look at your texture, wink, you'll see you're all lined up. So 512 by 16, 128. Just make a four-sided structure here. Rotate that. There we are. So we've got our interior walls all at 512, 128 units tall. If we look around, you'll see everything's lining up in the corners. Let's just throw a roof and a ceiling on here, maybe in some nice gray generic measure, and we'll save it out as a prefab. Block tool, back to drawing, keeping with our 16 unit floor. One grid unit here. Yep. Move it up. Just grab these two guys. We don't want them to be wall panels, so we'll bring this guy up. Dev. go a little up. We got our measure generic O1B. It's the gray guy. Apply. There you go. So you got some contrast in your room. You can tell the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. And let's just stick a little info player start entity. So this level would actually be able to just be player start. Would actually be able to be walked around in if we add the prefab and hit run on our map. We'd also be facing the wall. So Alt Enter will turn our guy around. 180. Apply. And you could add any range of guns or enemies or props into this. The suit, maybe some health or something. And that would be an instant prefab that you could place. So the next step to finalizing your prefab is to select everything that you've built that you want to be in your prefab. Zooming out a bit. And taking a look at the kind of green line that goes darker down the middle of our world that you can create here. And a prefab, when you place a prefab with the entity or the block creation tool, uses this center origin of our kind of void here to place it. So anything off to the side of that green axis, is going to be placed in relation to that. So if I were to click right here, I want to create a prefab right here, it's actually going to be up left a little bit. So it's best before you save your prefab to just center it, whatever it is, right on that green cross. Whoop. All right, and then make sure that you have it all selected still with everything you want in your prefab selected. Simply hit Create Prefab down at the bottom there. Simply click Create Prefab down at the bottom of the New Objects panel, or Tools, Create Prefab, Control R. And prefabs are saved within the program files, Steam, Steam Apps, your username, Source SDK bin folder under prefabs. The bin folder within Source SDK under your username also contains a lot of other handy Source developer tools. But inside the bin folder, we have prefabs. And inside prefabs, we can actually create a new folder. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to call it Noesis underscore prefabs. Okay, and inside that, I'm going to save my prefab. I'm going to save it as n underscore simple room. All right, so this is a simple room that we can reuse as we go on. And it saves it in the VMF format. It's the same format we create the rest of our levels with. And it basically is just going to let you import this VMF into your larger VMF. So say you're creating an office building and you come in here with your prefab and you create a prefab of a cubicle. It's got a desk, a chair, a computer, a keyboard, a plant, an exploding barrel, whatever you want inside your prefab. It can now also contain different entities. It can include functionality. So save, get a new map. All right, and with the entity or the block tool, choose from the category list. And from the categories list, you'll see the new folder that you saved in the prefabs. So we have Noesis prefabs, or whatever you called it. And within that, we have our N simple room. And now within our world, we can place our prefab, enter to create it. Boom, there you go. Use the camera view to get in there, and you've got all that stuff. And it's all grouped together in one convenient little package. So you can ungroup it, and away you go. Keep building, keep adding, add thousands of them to your level, whatever you want. That's prefabs. Visgroups are another very handy tool when you start creating maps, especially on a larger scale. So let's say, with our prefab here, we just placed 7 more prefabs. We have our N simple room. We just kept placing prefabs into our world. All right, so we've got several different prefabs here. But we want to be organized, right? We want to figure out what's going on in our world. So let's use Visgroups to help us out. To create a Visgroup, simply select an object or 2. In this case, we have simply the roof of one of our prefabs and one of the others completely. And click Hide Selected Objects. If we were to click hide unselected objects, our third prefab here would be the Visgroup which we're creating. But we want these two to be in a new Visgroup of their own. So we're going to hide the selected, and it asks us. Currently they're in the world geometry. It's where everything starts. New Visgroup of two objects. Not the best name. Let's name our new Visgroup Prefab Room. Okay. Disappears. The top of our one prefab and our complete prefab room disappear. But now in the Visgroups tab we have Prefab Room. Check it, and everything comes back, on or off. Let's say we also grabbed the rest of this object minus the roof and this guy. And we hid those. New prefab and called it something else. We called it Prefab Room 2. Now we have Prefab Room and Room 2. We can easily turn them on or off, which helps us already. Let's say you want to move objects between Visgroups, or you're not happy, or as you create more objects, you realize you need more groups, whatever the case is. So let's say we want all our roofs in a new prefab. We could grab them. I have to ungroup these guys here, or ignore the grouping. Grab the roofs, our three roofs. We're going to hide them. We're going to call it roofs. So now we have our roofs prefab. But you'll see, if I turn off my prefab room, my roofs goes gray because a portion of that is already off. Which works. You could have multiple objects in multiple groups, but if you want to stay, more organized, or you just prefer to do it, everything in individual Visgroups, we have options. If you select any object, any piece of geometry, Alt-Enter to bring up its object properties, you'll see the Visgroups tab within the Object Properties box. And it's going to tell you what Visgroups this object belongs to. So we could simply take this roof out of the Prefab Room, hit Apply, and now when we uncheck our Prefab Room, it's still there. But it is still part of the Roofs prefab. We also have the quick ability, if we have a list of, say, 30 Visgroups, and one or two of them turned off, we have the ability to quickly show all Visgroups quickly at once, or get back to our selection box. So you can show all of them, or go back to selecting them individually. And right now, one of our roofs is still in our Prefab Room 2. So another way to edit it, we could click to mark it, to select it, Alt-Enter. We don't want to take all these items out of here, so we'll just go right back to our roof. Automatically updates the object properties page with our roof. We'll take it out of the Prefab Room 2. We'll apply that. Now our roofs are just roofs. And these guys are on themselves, and you see it doesn't gray out the roofs anymore as maybe still part of that. So our Prefab Room still has a roof. So with our Prefab Room, we're going to mark. Bring up the properties, click on the roof there, take it out of the Prefab Room. Now they're all within the roofs and the Prefab Rooms, and you'll see nothing goes gray as you turn it off because they're all in separate groups. The Visgroups are divided into user and auto. The users are the groups that we're creating as we hide selected or unselected objects. The auto Visgroups are those automatically created for you. Hammer automatically creates Visgroups between your world geometry and your entities, and even point entities within that. So if you have lights and stuff like that, point entities will be separate. We don't have any lights in the scene, but you can see that if I turn off my world geometry, we have 3 of these info player stars just floating in space. And if we turn off entities, they go away. World geometry, zoom in, they're nowhere to be seen inside. So really handy, automatically helps you out there. Back to the user tab, there's a few other things we can do. Click on our roofs. So we want to add our roof Visgroup into our Prefab Room 2 Visgroup. We want this guy to just become part of the Prefab Room. Simply left-click and drag the Visgroup that you want to include within another Visgroup. Let go of the button. It's going to ask you, do you want to combine your roofs Visgroup into your Prefab Room 2 Visgroup? Say yes. Now within my Prefab Room 2 Visgroup, zoom out, you'll see the roofs along with the Prefab Room 2 disappear. We can also set up a hierarchy. much like you see within the auto groups for our own user groups. By right-clicking and dragging one Viz group to another, it's going to put it in a hierarchy. So now we have a hierarchical structure that we can turn on or off throughout. Anything at the top of the hierarchy will turn off everything below it, but you also have the option to turn off individual things as you get further and further down the hierarchy. So it can be really handy. And to simply delete a Viz group, just left-click it, drag it into the white void. You sure you want to delete it? Yep. Let's see, what else? We can mark our prefab, bring up the properties page. You'll see the button for edit groups. So let's edit the prefab room group. We get a few different options. We can give it a different name. You can assign it a color, create new groups, which you can assign colors and name and add more objects, entities to later. Yeah. So that is the beauty that is Visgroups and prefabs, which again are going to help you out tremendously as you create some pretty cool complex maps.